So we'll start this morning's work with the first exchange of views on the draft directive on the control and acquisition of and possession of weapons in the European Union. Vicky Ford is the rapporteur on this. I can't see Anna Maria yet from the shadows, but I'm sure she'll be along shortly. Nicola will take the floor on behalf of Mr. Cofferati. I can see Dieter for the ALDE group. For the GUI?
No, personne.
Nobody speaking for the GUI? Not for the moment, at least. The Greens? Pascal hasn't arrived yet. Mr. Vaskiewicz has arrived. And Mrs. Trzynski is there as well. So we already have colleagues to take the floor for the second round. We have a Commission representative. Mr. Alain is here. So I'll give the floor immediately to Vicky. Microphone, please.
Can I start by thanking the Secretariat for their huge help? It's been great to have the expertise of people who worked on the last revision of the Firearms Directive back in 2008. There is an enormous amount of public interest in this proposal. Many people are very concerned about the consequences of what is clearly poorly drafted, not perfect, and needs a lot of work. The absence of an impact assessment makes our work even harder. I've already had 2 very productive meetings with the shadows, those are the MEPs from each of the different political groups, and we have identified a list of issues. We've agreed that these are the issues we need to address, and I've produced a very much draft working paper which you may have, and this is already getting feedback from both inside and outside the Parliament. I know that a lot of people are going to be listening to this meeting from outside this room, either today or later. To those who are listening from outside, we hear your concerns. There's no need to keep overwhelming members by telling us what is wrong with the proposal. I think we've all had lots of emailers telling us what's wrong. We now need suggestions on how we can make it better. And please don't threaten us as members of the Parliament. We're trying to help to get better language. On the 15th of March, there will be a public hearing in this committee on this proposal, and I hope members will be able to get detailed views from experts, stakeholders from many different communities, and the list of those experts will be available on the IMCO website. So if anybody outside the room wants to get their views heard, please could they coordinate with their experts. We've tried to find an expert from each different stakeholder group and make sure that as many different concerns and possible suggestions of changes are raised there. There's a whole month before the first draft of my report is available, so I'm working as hard as possible. On some of the issues, on deactivation, the proposed complete ban on Category A firearms, even if deactivated, would, in my view, have serious negative consequences for people like reenactors, and this should be addressed by, in my view, continue to allow member states to have authorisations in special exemptions and keeping the exemption for deactivated firearms provided they are deactivated to adequate standards. Some holders of deactivated firearms have said they'd be more than happy to be expected to have a permit depending on the category or to comply with storage requirements, and I'd like to hear more from those affected by this proposal on those sorts of ideas. I've been told that requiring a new list to be compiled of all existing DACs would be unworkable, and so I'm minded to suggest that existing lists should be maintained, but new lists should be only compiled for future DACs. And whilst on the subject of DACs, I'm concerned that the new regulation adopted by the Commission may in some circumstances have actually introduced less robust standards, and therefore this needs to be reviewed promptly, and I'd be interested to hear drafting suggestions for how we may deal with deactivations which have already been done to very high standards so that they can maintain the status quo. On museums, the Commission's proposal would require museums to damage artefacts and not allow them to add anything new to their collections. That seems to me disproportionate, and I'd recommend that the existing text in the existing document be maintained, but with clearer language both on what constitutes a museum and on the nature of their responsibilities. I'd be interested to hear colleagues' views on collectors. On A7, the Commission proposes to move category B7 to A7, i.e. to ban semi-automatics for civilian use which resemble automatic guns. This is unclear, and we know that, for example, in Germany it was legally very problematic. I'm therefore considering a number of steps, including reintroducing the Member States' special authorisation and returning A7 to B7, but perhaps coupling that with stronger requirements, for example, on storage or training. I have asked the Commission if there was a specific type of firearm that they intended to prohibit when they moved B7 to A7, and the evidence for this, as that would enable us to consider whether or not we should put other much more specific language in that clause. On the Member State exemption, the Commission proposes to remove the right for Member States to give special exemptions which would have an impact on forensic laboratories, proof houses, military armourers and many others. I'd like to hear members' views on reinstating the special authorisation procedures that Member States are allowed to have. On conditions for getting authorisations, the Commission's proposals for those under the age of 18, for medical tests and for 5-year durations all need to be looked at. They've all had a very high level of concern, and I've put some detail of that on my working paper. On convertibility, there is a real issue with the existing law on reconverting firearms that were supposed to be rendered inoperable forever, and that those have been reconverted back into live firearms. This does need clarification and is a real loophole. The Commission proposed several new definitions and implementing measures. In my working paper, you'll see that I'm inviting a discussion about a possible simpler approach here, such as by focusing on essential components. If that approach is not workable, then perhaps we might follow a similar line to that being discussed in the Council, which would, as I understand it, require that firearms that have been converted into blank firers or acoustic weapons should remain in their original category. On the issue of distance sales, you'll see in my paper a suggestion that there should be a requirement that at the last point of transfer of a firearm, you need to make sure that you recognise the correct authorisations are in place. This would allow you, for example, to advertise or to make discussions about a transfer on a distance manner, but that the final sale should happen person to person, or there's some suggestions I've put for remote rural areas. And on ammunition, you'll see some suggestions in my paper as well. On replicas and airsoft, I'm nearly finished. The current legislation does not restrict items based on their physical appearance, for example, replicas or toys, because these are covered elsewhere in European and national legislation. And from what I've heard, I'm minded to say that the existing status quo should continue and that those items, replicas, should be covered elsewhere, but not in this legislation. Furthermore, some member states are looking at clarifying the definition of what is a firearm to make it clear that non-lethal, low-powered objects, such as those used in airsoft, would not fall under the current definition of firearm. I'm very happy to receive suggestions for amendments. I've had, as I said, lots of emails telling us what's wrong, but not very many telling us practical ways of how we could draft changes to make it better. So the more that we can get from experts or from collective groups on suggestions of improvements would be very helpful. I have heard, for example, many suggestions that we might want to put something about minimum standards for security and storage, that a lot of different firearms users across Europe have said they would be very happy to share best practice in those sorts of areas. So language on drafting that would be useful. Finally, I would like to reiterate to those listening from outside that the Commission is no longer in the driving seat with this proposal. It will be members of the Parliament and Member States through the European Council who are now can accept, reject or amend anything in the proposal. So we have got a number of different areas which I'm looking forward to working on. Thank you very much. Sorry if that was a bit long.
No, that was excellent. Thank you very much, Vicky. I think everything is quite clearly on the table. If it's okay with you, we'll start with the shadows before the Commission. So I'll give the floor to Anna Maria, and then in a couple of minutes I'll read the list of all the other colleagues who've asked for the floor. So if you haven't yet asked for the floor, do it now. Virginie, you asked for the floor? Okay, so put your names on the list and then I'll read it out in a moment. Anna Maria first.
Merci beaucoup, Robert. Good morning, everybody. I very much welcome your paper, Vicky, and the line that you have taken as a rapporteur so far. The shadow meetings we had, the hearings with the experts, has been very useful. And I would also, like you did, reassure everybody that many of us don't consider the Commission proposal satisfactory. And it is now in our hands, together with the Council, to amend it and to make the right balance between separating the legally owned weapons, where there is already a strong protection, and the illegal traffic of weapons, which is a different issue. So we have to take the positive parts of this report, like the registration issue, harmonising the way to register, the traceability, the deactivation, as Vicky, you so well described it, that I will just say that I support what you said on the activation without getting into repeating what you said. I fully agree with it. And avoiding and preventing that legally owned weapons go in the wrong hands, but not effective people, normal citizens that have the right to legally own weapons for legally recognised activities. This distinction is not clear in the Commission proposal, and we have to work on that. So the scope, I would say, and the clarity and the proportionality and the necessity of this review of the directive are the key issues that I think we have together to look. So in your working document, you very well underline a few of the issues that really need to be amended. Article 2 on collectors and museums. I wonder at all if there's a need even to review this part, because basically, as the proposal looks now, the category A, collectors or museums would have to destroy or not to be able to acquire some of the weapon. It would even have let's say, an impact on historical valid artifacts. So I think we very much agree between the rapporteur and me on this. Medical checks, Article 5.2. Of course, it's extremely important to assure that weapons are not in the hands of people that are not suited to use them, but there are different ways to ensure physical and psychological fitness. So here I would go for a minimum standards of harmonisation. And I would like to take the example of Sweden, where there is no need for medical checks, but there is a legally recognised requirement from doctors to report if their patients are unfit to have weapons. And that system so far works very well in Sweden. So let's leave the member states to decide on the how and have the common objective to assure that no one who is unfit to have weapons would be able to own it. On distance sales, Article 6, same. Already both the buyer and the seller have the duty to have a license. Not anyone can buy on the internet or via email or via telephone via distance if you don't have the right to own a weapon. Of course, we're not talking about the dark web, which is in any way already illegal. Here I think what we could think about, instead of banning, looking for some form of checking that you have a license, that those who buy have a license. But banning, I think, would really affect the countryside in a way that is disproportionate. The 5 years licenses, Article 7.4. Again, let's not charge of unnecessary bureaucracy and administration and costs those who have the right to legally own weapons. And here also I would go for minimum harmonization, minimum standards for the member states to decide which system to use to assure that there is a full control of who owns and who doesn't own legally weapons. So the other point in the annex is about semi-automatic guns. Here really I think the fact that there is a ban for semi-automatic rifles that resemble automatic weapons is really unacceptable, because it creates enormous uncertainty. We don't know how many weapons that would affect. So there is a need for a much clearer definition. What does it mean resembles? What does it mean certain kind of semi-automatic weapons? What does it mean convertible weapons? And as Vicky said, here we very much welcome the suggestions and the advice of experts. It's a very technical issue, and of course the police and the military as well. I have personally had meetings, and we have invited them to our hearings. And by the way, some have told us that this would, the proposal how it looks now, would even affect military and police training, because some kind of dynamic weapons are used for of course, totally legal training. You mentioned, Vicky, the issue of possible addition of safe storage of guns. I think that could be a good idea. I think that would not affect freedom of citizens to use legally weapon, and a minimum rule for safe storage of firearm ammunition is something we can definitely look together. I just highlighted the key points because you were so comprehensive both in your working document and in your presentation this morning. So let's focus on strengthening the good part of the revision of the directive, like deactivation, harmonised compulsory marking, increased cross-border cooperation, and let's get rid of the issue that are just creating costs and administrative burdens to citizens who have the right to legally own and use weapons. I very much look forward to work with you and to all the other shadows. Thank you so much.
Merci.
Thank you, Anna Maria. I'll now give the floor to Nicola, who will be speaking on behalf of Mr. Cofferati for the S&D Group. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Cofferati sent his apologies. He couldn't be here today because of some medical tests that he's having done. So he's asked me to pass on his opinions, although he will be able to explain them better himself in the upcoming discussions and shadow meetings. The working document put forward by the rapporteur is a very positive approach to the topic. It is cautious and practical. The fact that the discussion has taken place in an informal way is welcomed, and there are various options on the table. The directive reform is something that is expected for halfway through this year, and it is part of the European security agenda. This was put forward by the Commission, closely linked to the fight against terrorism, and we have seen, and it's been accelerated following the November Paris attacks. It should be part of a more general security strategy. Clearly, terrorists have been armed through the illegal market. of course, we have to intensify our fight against this market. However, it's also true that between the illegal market and legal market, there is an overlap, particularly linked to disactivation and components. These have to be looked at closely, and through this directive, we will be able to make progress on these issues. On the main points in the proposal, as they're set out in the working document, we think that the idea of looking at the components and the physical appearance of the goal, as well as the technical features, is a good idea, particularly essential components. It's important to ensure that these components are kept in the scope of the directive, and we also believe in the principle that these should be seen as part of the highest category that they can be. On the technical characteristics, I think that in upcoming weeks we'll be able to come forward with a possible proposal to the most sensitive issue, which is moving from category B7 to A7. We're looking at this in greater depth, basing our work on the proposal made by the rapporteur, and I think we'll be able to go into more detail in this once we define criteria that will better define how dangerous an arm is. Then for historical or cultural ownership of arms, we're going to have to look at differentiating between museums and collectors. At the moment, there isn't a European definition of collector, and we can't just grant indefinite exemptions to this. Then on medical tests to get a permit, we would be in favour, as we would be in favour of a maximum 5-year period for permit renewal. When it comes to differences between national systems, I think these are sensible standards which would be in the general interest. On distance sales, this is a very sensitive issue. Arms can't be seen as goods like any other. So the Commission proposal to limit their online sales to intermediaries is reasonable, we think. If the police authorities can verify the identity of the buyer and the fact that they have authorization, we wouldn't be against that, but we'd have to have a look at what the role of the monitoring authority would be. They shouldn't, however, be coupled with munition sales online, because that will lead to greater suspect sales. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you, Nicola. I'll now read the list of colleagues who have asked to take the floor after the shadows.
Donc, Madame Metsola, Madame Yakonsari, Madame Mitzi, Monsieur Wilson, Madame Callas, Madame Senalova, Monsieur Halla-aho, Monsieur Schwab, Monsieur Guoga, Madame Rosière, Monsieur Pospisil, Monsieur Florenz, Monsieur Carver et Madame Grappini. Est-ce que je n'ai oublié personne?
Have I forgotten anyone? So you can see there are quite a lot of people on the list. Please already have a think about how you can say what you need to in as brief a time as possible to ensure that we have time for a discussion with everyone. I'll give the floor to Dieter for Aldi now, please.
Merci. Sorry. Thank you, Vicky. I would like to thank you for the working document that you sent out last week. Okay. I think it's a very good basis for our following discussion, and I would like to say how much I appreciate the document and the way how you decided to deal with this issue and include us, shadow rapporteurs, in the preparation of the report. Since the presentation of the Commission's proposal, I keep saying that there is a strong case for updating the EU directive on firearms, especially after what happened in France. We can improve measures concerning marking, control and traceability of firearms in civilian possession, strengthen exchange of information between member states and better control online sales of firearms. I also support the inclusion of deactivated firearms in the directive and the harmonisation of deactivation measures. But in order to get that, we need to make sure the directive is well balanced and acceptable. Otherwise, I don't believe we can achieve results we all expect. Now, concerning your working document, let me give you some feedback on those areas I find the most important. Firstly, on the proposed ban of some types of semi-automatic weapons, it is quite hard to imagine how the Commission's proposal could work in practice and is hardly acceptable. Your working paper is quite realistic in this part and presents reasonable options. My preference goes to the option 4.2, which combines definition of armed forces, possibility for the member states to grant exceptions, and also keeps the B7 category without any changes. This is a good combination of measures which can help us to strike the right balance. I also welcome the part which makes a distinction between characteristics and appearance of the weapon. In principle, it is possible to keep deactivated weapons within the scope of the directive as long as they were originally Category A firearms and the Member States can authorise its use outside military or security forces if needed. On the other hand, I find useful to exclude from the scope of the proposal such things as toy guns, other kind of harmless replicas, etc. When speaking of essential components of a firearm, in case of the directive, it includes its definition. It has to be clear, definite and conclusive. As for the blank firing weapons, I agree that the Commission's proposal is rather complicated and welcome your initiative to make it simple. However, I would be happy if you can clarify to your proposal 3.1, which says that weapons converted to firing blank remain in their original category. Would it mean that a Category A firearm, for instance, would still be a Category A, even when blank firing? Okay. Another related question concerns museum collections. The Commission's proposal on this type of weapons is not justified and could lead, indeed, to irreversible damage to historical collections. As mentioned in your 5.1, the museums need to be authorised to possess Category A weapons for showing purposes. The idea of authorisation granted from the Member States level together with complying with precisely defined storage measures is very interesting and would merit to be developed. When discussing authorisation rules for gun holders and gun users, I believe we need to keep the possibility under certain conditions for persons under 18 to acquire and possess a weapon. There are very practical reasons such as forestry schools or sport shooting. As for the medical checks, I fully support your proposal under 5.2.1, in which the Member States decides between periodic medical review and continuous monitoring. Very briefly on the remaining issues, I support your proposals on distance sales. That is a system in which the identity and authorisation of the buyer is verified. Also, the use and functioning of the European Firearms Pass may be improved in order to carry out better control. When it comes to ammunition, I would be interested in getting more information on the proposed flagging of suspicious sales and on possible limits for the acquisition of ammunition. Finally, concerning the Commission's deactivation regulation, it would be preferable to insert an option of equivalent ways of deactivation prior to the regulation's entry into force as an alternative. I am afraid that if we propose to review it, it would end up potentially with another long-lasting process, which is not in our interest. Sorry it was rather long, but I think it merits to have a detailed discussion. I can communicate also this remark in writing, and I am looking forward to our further discussion with all the shadows. Thank you.
Merci, Dita.
Thank you, Dita. Now for GUE, Mr. Mastalka.
Thank you very much, Chair. I can see that most of what I wanted to say has already been said. I'd like to underscore that we welcome the Commission's idea of the incentive behind this to increase public safety, and that the Commission is trying to establish comparable rules for all Member States. Now, we know, you cannot avoid knowing that this is a sensitive area which doesn't just interest our citizens, but it does also cause concern, as testified to by the dozens of emails I'm receiving on this subject. I have personal experience with this topic because I was able to participate in creating Czech legislation on firearms and weapons, and that was in the 50s. I'd like to say that Czech legislation could indeed serve as an example because it was based on different traditions and legislation than Western legislation. I'd also like to say that we haven't yet had a wide-ranging discussion on this issue. As a shadow rapporteur, I will be standing up for my opinion, namely that the Commission's proposal is by no means perfect and that it needs redrafting. For example, I do not agree with the absolute ban for private individuals and societies to carry or to hold automatic weapons, because most crimes are perpetrated by illegal weapons. I think it also going to be necessary to rework some definitions from moving weapons from one category to another, which might lead to some categories of weapons either being banned for the first time or being the first time subject to compulsory registration, and which might affect a wide public. You also need to consider conversions or the possibility for people to hand in weapons during a weapons amnesty. I'll try and table constructive amendments to construct amendments such a way that they won't increase the number of illegally held weapons, particularly semi-automatic weapons newly included under category A, and to make table amendments to stop this Commission proposal reducing safety. Now, of course, I'm prepared for all forms of constructive cooperation. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. For the Greens, Mr. Saltis, who's speaking on behalf of Pascal Durand, who's not here today.
Yes, thank you for the floor. I will speak on behalf of Monsieur Pascal Durand. We strongly support the more clear definition and clarification of definition, because current definition in a lot of cases could cause a lot of problems. Also, who is the who and to whom this directive will cause a problem because of unclear definition. We also support the highest standards for the activation and the regulation of common standards for activation. We also support the better information exchange between member states, which is really necessary, and the system should be interoperable, computerized and automated. We believe that the deactivated weapon should be kept with the original category, and also we think that we have to make a clear definition regarding the semi-automatic weapon, because current regime is not really clear. Also, we think that exchange data between the member states is an essential one, because otherwise these directives really could miss the main target. Thank you.
On dirait que Pascal Durand est...
Yeah, Pascal has just arrived, 2 minutes late. Never mind. Now for the EFTD, Mr. Ivaskovic.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to confirm and underline, as Ms. Ford was gracious enough to say at the beginning, that this is an issue which really is provoking real interest. I'm getting a lot of emails about this. Lots of people are turning to me directly. So this matter is, I think, far broader, far more broadly concerning that than it might at first seem. Now, I personally never knew anything about guns before, and I decided to hold a meeting about arms. I met collectors and holders just to try and understand the problems surrounding these groups of stakeholders, because I think these are the groups of people who'd be most affected by the new directive. Unfortunately, the Commission's proposal on holding arms does confirm the thesis that security is used as a fig leaf to try and deprive citizens of more and more of their liberty. The changes proposed will not, in my view, in any way improve people's security. On the contrary, I believe they'll have the opposite effect. The Commission wants to restrict access to legal weapons on the civilian market. And in many European countries, that market is already extremely heavily regulated. In Israel, for example, the government has seen that the best way of defending people from terrorist attacks is to arm the population and guaranteeing broad access to arms. The Commission's proposal would interfere into the arms production market, as well as making it hard to engage in sport shooting or in hunting or in historical collecting. You can see the gaping lack of a impact assessment which looks at the loss this would represent for private people and society in general. There is also insufficient information on the illegal use of legally acquired weapons. In this context, we should remember that during the Second World War, the Polish resistance movement was able to produce arms and ammunition en masse, including several hundred machine guns, despite bans on doing so. So you can still manufacture guns yourself. You can find the information on the internet. All you need is a workshop and materials you can get in any DIY store. So does the Commission also plan to restrict information to online or to books? What about printing guns and 3D printers? These types of weapons cannot be detected by metal detectors, and you could therefore be able to take them on board of a plane. This means that you can hardly talk about legal changes, because even if these changes are introduced, they will not do the job they were designed for. As for the key modifications in categories A and B, particularly A7 and B7, and in Annex 1, those changes will only restrict people's personal freedoms and civil liberties. I don't want to spend too much time on technical issues. I have no doubt that there'll be a further discussion on that in the working groups. But I do agree with the rapporteur's proposals on acoustic and salute weapons, for example, that current legislation does not need to be changed, and that they are blank weapons already sufficiently regulated. As for other technical points, There, I'm sure we'll have a further, more in-depth discussion later. Coming to a close, however, I would like to mention the idea of introducing further information on point 5.2. There's a 5-year license for automatic weapons, which can be extended only after a positive medical opinion, a medical text. There, I am open to suggestions. Thank you.
Merci. Et enfin...
Thank you. And finally, last shadow, Mrs. Krosinski for the ENF group.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm not particularly a specialist in firearms, so I'm now looking forward to the hearing with experts on the 15th of March next in order to learn more about the technical details. Now, your working document, Rapporteur, gives us a good basis for our work, especially as regards strengthening standards, as regards neutralising or deactivating weapons, marking weapons, medical visits and so on, all the points already touched upon. I'd just like to remind you about the fight against terrorism, however, which is touched on in the Commission document, and also we have to talk about the illegal trade in arms. Now, this is a problem which can never be solved by this directive, and certainly not as long as external EU borders and Member States' internal borders are not dealt with and covered in this document. Also, this report is being submitted without an impact analysis as regards the measures that can be taken as regards to collections of arms, deactivated arms, and so on and so forth. We're also concerned about the illegal possession of arms and the measures to be taken there, which could be unfair to hunters and other people, and farmers and other people who should be able to hold firearms. I'm not sure that the objective or the measures proposed by the Commission are appropriate here, and nor are they appropriate or going to be effective, I think, as regards preventing future terrorist attacks. Time and again, the Commission tells us that this proposal would do nothing to change the situation for hunters and sport shooters, although I believe it will have a profound impact on such categories. And these people are the most respectful of the law and the most rigorous in the way they conduct themselves. I believe in imposing these restrictions, the European Commission will put us in a situation whereby there will be more restriction on legal firearms holders and the measures will have no effect on preventing firearms reaching potential terrorists. Anyway, having said that, I look forward to the debate in this committee so that we can amend the Commission's proposal as well as we can. Thank you. Thank you, says the Chair. So that was the first round of debate. And now other members who've asked for the floor. We have 14 on the list. So please be as brief as you can. 1 minute each, I would say, please. That would be ideal because we still have to listen to the Commission and then have a summary from our rapporteur. So Mrs. Mazzola is the first on the list.
Let me start by saying that I agree with the rapporteur's approach on this dossier. Our starting point should be that most of the firearms legally owned or held in the EU should not be equated to criminals or terrorists. We have to be careful to ensure that this legislation treats the large number of law-abiding collectors and enthusiasts and users also, as the rapporteur mentioned, for military and training purposes in the EU fairly. The current proposal needs to better reflect this. The working document we have in front of us is clear when it comes to exempting museums from this directive. We do, however, need to look further into whether this exemption could also be extended to bona fide collectors in the spirit of subsidiarity. The regulation of collectors and museums is currently a member state competence and we should do our best for it to remain this way. I also agree with the rapporteur that any changes to the current legislation should be proportionate. Many experts regard the Maltese firearms legislation as a good basis to find a balance between security and the rights of enthusiasts, and I would be happy to provide more information if this would help our discussions. In conclusion, We should also make sure that we do not focus our efforts solely on the changes in the legislation, while disregarding the need for proper controls. Proper enforcement of this legislation should be at the heart of our work. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Jaakonsaari.
Arvoisa puhemies, puheenjohtaja, todellakin minä myös kiitän.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'd also like to thank Mrs. Ford for this excellent working document. And I'd also like to thank her for the way she has taken note of the enormous amount of feedback and criticism of this directive. Now, we're concerned here about the illegal possession and illegal acquisition of arms. At the moment, we have an inadequate system of controls in the internal market, and that means that there is a considerable amount of illegal acquisition of firearms going on and illegal possession indeed. I'd like to draw your attention to the situation in Finland, because in Finland we found a security police approach, a solution which we find to be credible. And our system involves a system of reserve soldiers, reserve military. That's to say, many people in Switzerland are trained with a view to keeping the country secure. And we believe this has had an effect on people's attitude to firearms. I'd also draw attention to Article 6 and the idea of protecting national borders and preserving national security. And also I'm concerned about the availability or potential availability of arms to under 18s. In rural areas, many young people have just one hobby, and that is hunting. And it would be a great shame if father and son, for example, would be unable to continue this hobby together.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, I am also in agreement with the rapporteur's proposal and about this directive. I feel it is very lacking. Although I must say that I do agree with the main objectives, to make it difficult to acquire arms in the European Union, but we don't need this directive to tell us that we do not agree with illegal trafficking and we don't agree that public safety is put in jeopardy. I hope this is not a reaction to the Paris activities, because this is a very, very important document that we must produce, because it will affect a lot of people, a lot of bona fide people. It is very serious, a very serious flaw that an impact assessment has not been made, because an impact assessment would have addressed the problems and the solutions of all the stakeholders. It hasn't been done, and I consider this a very serious flaw of the Commission's directive proposal as is. We have heard statements that collectors are linked to illegal trafficking, and this is a serious problem. I don't believe this is correct, and there is no proof of this. It seems to be the basis of this proposal, one of the thrusts of these proposals, and I think this is a wrong assumption. If we're going to propose directives on wrong assumptions, we're going to accept wrong results. The directive affects collectors, museum and sportsmen who conduct honest activities, and I don't feel that this is solving the problem of terrorism. Terrorists do not acquire, as we all know, we do not acquire arms through legal means. Finally, I feel that the Commission's proposal, although I agree with the initial scope of it, needs major surgery. It needs major surgery because we need to find the balance between public security, which as we know is very important, and safeguarding bona fide citizens who are collectors, museums and sportsmen. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. And now Mr. Nielsen.
Tack så mycket. Jag tycker det är...
Thank you. I'm very pleased to hear that the rapporteur and shadow are all saying that this Commission proposal needs to be reworked to be acceptable. I'm glad that we have such a broad-based approach in agreement. There are, of course, a number of good points in this proposal on deactivation, for example, or a common system of marking, because even a legally acquired weapon can get in the wrong hands. But being a Swede, I'd like to say that we have 600,000 gun licenses in Sweden. Very many of our citizens have a license to hold arms. It's a large group who are interested in hunting or sport or forestry. But there's also an element of voluntary self-defense organizations, and there is no connection between those 600,000 licenses and terrorist activity, which is organized by criminals. There is zero, I repeat, zero link between those two. You need to chase those people who have illegal weapons, and you do not need to make life difficult for people who have legal licenses. You need to concentrate your efforts on those who are bearing arms illegally.
Merci, Madame Callas. Vous faites...
Thank you, Mrs. Callas. Please make an effort. We'd like you to be as brief as possible, please.
I tried to be brief. So many things have been already said by colleagues, so I will focus only on few topics. I think it would be better to focus on who is granted authorization and not which weapons belong in which category, as most member states have not even been using the categories up to now. It is very important to clarify which components are essential when we talk about the essential components of the arms. So currently the list is open-ended, but it should be a closed list to be clear. On classification, I totally support the rapporteur's approach on 4.2. And finally, as also Mrs. Metsola pointed out, the collectors, I think the collector should be understood that it can be either legal entity or a private person. So this wording of Article 6 should be improved. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Mrs. Senalova.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the rapporteur for this excellent working document. It is a really good basis for further work. I'll only be talking about a few points. Let me start by saying that in the Czech Republic, this proposal has evoked largely negative reactions, and in many cases those reactions were justified. But perhaps I could start by accentuating the positive. I welcome including acoustic and salute weapons into the scope of the directive, and creating minimum technical requirements for their conversion from live weapons. Now, I think that added value could also be created by having a proper firearms marking system or information sharing between member states. I also welcome the rapporteur's suggestion on minimum requirements for safe weapon storage and the possibility for traders to reject suspicious transactions. I think that there is further work necessary on the proposal to restrict the capacity of chambers for 6 cartridges, which is a lot for hunting but not enough for sport. Now, the Commission's proposal does contain problematic proposals too, which many experts have said are disproportionate and unjustified too. For example, categorizing self-loading weapons with the appearance of an automatic weapon under category A, as well as the creation of a new category on semi-automatic weapons converted from automatic weapons. I also see no reason for air weapons and airsoft weapons to be included under the scope, because in most cases these types of weapons are useless. They cannot be used in a terrorist attack. I think the registration of deactivated weapons is also problematic, where people are suggesting marking all deactivated weapons and keeping them in registers. Now, I'd be very interested in the Commission's arguments of why these suggestions are helpful and from what assessments they flow. Thank you.
Monsieur Halla-aho.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mrs. Ford. The Commission seems to be unable to make up their mind about the aim and motivation of certain elements of this proposal. The proposal text speaks of terrorism. In our committee hearings, the Commission talks about terrorism. We have shown the Commission time and again that Category B7 firearms, with which the Commission seems to be obsessed, have nothing to do with terrorism. The Commission response has been that actually the proposal is not about terrorism, it is about long-term security and gun control. Well, if that is the case, what is the urgency? Why is there no impact assessment as required by the better regulation guidelines? It is up to the Commission to show why it is necessary to ban and confiscate people's legal property, take away their hobby, and kill a large number of small and medium-sized businesses. You must show with facts and figures that B7 firearms are a problem. In our committee hearings, the Commission says that you want to ban Kalashnikovs. That is good propaganda because Kalashnikov sounds scary. This, however, is not what the proposal says. It says in the proposal that you want to ban semi-automatic firearms which resemble automatic firearms. That definition covers virtually all semi-automatic rifles used in modern sports shooting. You say that your proposal is based on studies and their recommendations. On the website of the European Parliament, one can find an in-depth analysis of the proposal. The evaluations and studies to which you refer, and which are summarised in the analysis, make several recommendations, especially concerning data exchange, markings and deactivation standards. They do not mention B7 firearms or a need to transfer them to the A category. Your proposal is not based on studies. Thank you very much.
Andreas.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. Ich möchte es ganz...
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. I'm very pleased with the current exchange of views. I think we've managed to have a very pragmatic approach to the issues we're facing. On the one hand, there are undoubted elements where still problems. I mean, I come from Baden-Württemberg, where 2 years ago we had a school shooting. A pupil came with his father's sport gun and perpetrated an attack. And I think that everyone who studied that case in detail was able to see that there are small elements in terror attacks, too small elements, but nevertheless important, where you need to be careful to create and shape the single market in such a way that where possible we prevent the possibility that legally acquired weapons are used illegally. However, I don't want to criticise the Commission's more generally. For example, the suggestion that this directive proposal might stop terrorism. That would be an erroneous suggestion. It would make that possible. I think that I'd be very grateful to the rapporteur and the shadows for finding the right form of words to try and reflect our progress. Thank you.
Monsieur Guogua.
Thank you very much. I think this proposal needs to be thrown in the bin. I think it's dangerous, it's awful and atrocious. I think there hasn't been any effort put into it. There's been a reaction to an event that happened, which we all feel terrible about. For example, of Lithuania, we've got the Russian aggressor knocking on our door. We've got the Lithuanian Šaulių Sąjunga who will defend us, who have these weapons, and this is our hope. So if you interfere so much in countries' rights as not to defend ourselves, we will have a serious problem. And I think people need to take responsibility for not doing an impact assessment. Heads have to fall here. This is not helping Europe. These proposals are dangerous. Let's be serious, please.
Merci, Monsieur Pospisil.
Thank you, Mr. Pospisil.
Děkuji.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to echo what my colleagues said in expressing their criticism of this file. I'm also extremely sceptical. and I do not think that is currently in any acceptable form. I am not a weapons expert by any means, but as a politician, I am guided by a fundamental principle. I do not want to accept a directive which would be a burden on European citizens who hold weapons legally. So let's approach this from a political point of view. Let's not just impose further nonsensical burdens on our citizens, because that will come back to bite us politically. My colleague Ms. Sehnalova has said it already. This proposal has provoked huge emotions, a huge debate in the Czech Republic. The Parliament has adopted a resolution rejecting the proposals of the directive, and I join that. There are some good ideas in it, however, for example, registration, deactivation, or information exchange between member states. But then there is a whole slew of things which would just make people's lives more difficult, in my belief. People's lives, well, those people are not terrorists who are law-fearing and fulfill their obligations. For example, when it comes to extending category A, forbidding semi-automatic weapons resembling automatic weapons, would make collectors' lives more difficult. When it comes to paintball guns, airsoft guns, etc., this is all difficult. So please, coming to a close, please let's take people's freedoms and this political dimension into account. Let's not adopt something which would be a restriction on people's lives without fighting terrorism.
Okay, if we can speed it up now in the last bit, Mr. Florence, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'm the oldest or second oldest serving MEP in the Parliament. I've never read a directive proposed by the Commission which has been so off the hoof. It's so rushed. I am a hunter, and there's a really bad accident 14 days ago, and only 14 days after that, people like collectors, hunters and sports people, they seem to be the front line in fighting terrorism in this directive. Hearing this, I think the Commission can only do one sensible thing. It can wait for what happens in March, and then should come to the conclusion that all the faults contained in this directive need to be tackled, need to be rooted out, and the Commission needs to come back with a new paper. I call upon the Commission to send this back. I mean, I'm in favour of a directive. Yes, I don't want to shift into long grass, but this is ridiculous. We cannot feed our citizens such nonsense. The Commission has the great advantage of never having to be elected. Take this to the Lower Rhine, take this to your electorate. I mean, everyone will throw you out. So please, please, come to your senses. I agree with medical tests. I very much agree with that principle. But please, please do make an effort to make some sense.
Thank you, Chair. This proposed directive aims to punish law-abiding citizens and does nothing to protect our citizens from terrorism. It's not a hammer, but an anvil to crack a nut. And I find it an absolute disgrace that the Commission can even contemplate legislating without having first carried out an impact assessment. The lack of an impact assessment is for all to see, and I will briefly highlight how some of these changes will affect ordinary law-abiding citizens. Firstly, this proposal severely affects the cultural and historical sector. It calls for museums to deactivate Category A weapons. This means that historically significant weapons, which subsequently are not to blame for the recent terrorist attacks, will significantly lose their historic value. As Winston Churchill once said, a nation that fails to respect its history does not have a future. Secondly, the proposal will also impact parts of the guns which are of no practical use to terrorists, such as silencers. Banning silencers only wastes valuable police time, Chair, and is not required by the UN Firearms Protocol. Thirdly, the proposal will also move the category of semi-automatic firearms for civilian use, which resemble weapons with automatic mechanisms, to Category A.
I'll have to stop you for a moment. It seems like there is no translation into German.
Ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch. Excuse me.
Oui, mais si vous voulez parler allemand, mais c'est...
You can speak German if you like. I think the German booth switched back on now.
So where do you want me to have to start again? No, okay.
Juste le condensé du condensé.
Okay.
Just as quick as
The proposal will also move the category of semi-automatic firearms for civilian use which resemble weapons with automatic mechanisms to category A. This means that weapons in this be prohibited for personal possession. In the UK, this was largely affect for possession and use of .22 rimfire semi-automatic rifles, which are currently used in my country for pest control and target sports. The recent terrorist attacks were a result of Schengen's freedom of movement and goods allowing counterfeit weapons to be smuggled throughout Europe with ease. This proposal does nothing to address this issue whatsoever and is based on no evidence and must be opposed. With an industry turnover of more than 20 billion euros and 600,000 people employed in that sector, it would be inconceivable to support the proposals as they currently stand. Terrorists have already destroyed the lives of thousands in Europe. Don't let them destroy the livelihoods of any more. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Grappini.
Thank you, Mrs. Grappini.
Mulțumesc foarte mult, sper să mă încadrez într-un minut.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
It's a very difficult report and Vicky and the rapporteurs have a real problem. As you can see, and allow me to rebalance the discussion and speak on behalf of the citizens. Obviously, we should not fall into a trap and deprive of weapons people who guard museums or other objectives. But the way the proposal of the Commission is formulated, is drafted, well, it should be changed. As our colleague Andreas said, we have problems related to the legal persons who have weapons. And we also have a problem with the medical certificate. And we believe that not only illegal arms and legal arms are not subject to a harmonised regime. I don't see why the Commission should report every 5 years on the regime of arms. If it is so important, the Commission should come up with at least 2 reports during a 5-year term of office. We do need harmonised legislation because we cannot forbid persons who legally reside in a member state to possess a weapon. We need to harmonise, we need to rationalise, but we should be deprived of any passion whatsoever. We must speak about freedoms for the citizens and security for the citizens.
Mr. Harris.
Well, Chair, Rapporteur. I like to come back to the working document because we're switching in this discussion. We're switching between the evaluation of the Commission's the Commission's proposal and a general discussion. And this is still a working document. It's not yet a draft. Now, I think that we know that the working document will be steered by the lobby into the right form. So I think that the time is still ripe for further discussion, and I think it's important that we should make it very clear that the majority of people who possess weapons are no public danger, and this means that we need to be very sensitive in approaching this issue, particularly when tackling the Commission's proposal, however we decide to tackle it. It's good that the working document concentrates on the characteristics and not the appearance of weapons. I think that it is good that deactivated weapons are being excluded from the scope of the directive. It is good that components which are not crucial to the functioning of the weapon are excluded. I think that the fact that essential components are included is important. They should be covered by the scope. And I also think that is good, and that it is very much to be welcomed what we have about alarm, signals, salute and acoustic weapons. That whole paragraph is good. There's a debate here, evidently, which need to be continued, and this working paper is a good introduction to Chapter 6, then points 4, 5, 6 and 7. But perhaps I could point out that this is also a good spur to member states, that member states could also decide or look at how they control weapons possession. I'll be discussing this further later.
Le dernier intervenant, c'est...
The last speaker is Nicola Danti, speaking on a personal basis. Oh, apologies. I thought you'd said... Okay, you can have the floor. There was a misunderstanding. I apologize. I'm quite surprised that I had to remind you of this after what happened in Paris. A lot of our colleagues are saying that arms are sold legally and then they're sold illegally to criminals. But sadly, this picture is somewhat more complicated, and I'm going to give you some examples. I think it shows that we need this review of the directive urgently. I can support the Commission when it suggests to redefine blank arms. At the moment, acoustics aren't in the scope of the directive, and they're being sold freely on the market. And you could have just made those legal by removing some small pieces. So then on the traceability of arms, particularly the data that we have today, data has to be conserved for 20 years, but at the moment the data isn't sufficient. For example, in the March 2012 attacks in Toulouse, the attacks on Jewish schools, they had a pistol from the Second World War. In 2015 in Paris, one of the assault rifles was from the 1960s, another was from 1952. So this shows that these have to have traceability. Yes, collectors might have some concerns. Security in Europe might mean that they have to face some difficult times. Also, the rapporteur says that she wants to, or asks a question about distance sales. I think we need better regulation for online arms sales. In 2012, in France, there were a Kalashnikov assault that wounded 4 people. They'd bought some of the pieces necessary for that on the internet. There was another example in the Rhone region where they had bought arms illegally online, and this was done by individuals selling arms online without any sales permit or sales authorization. So I hope that these examples will prove to colleagues that we need urgent revision of this directive. Yes, there hasn't been an impact assessment, but that's because of the urgency involved. However, we have seen that gaps do still exist, and recent events show that this revision is required. Mr. Danti, to finish. Yes, Chairman. Sorry, I already read out Mr. Kovarati's opinions. But the debate has been very interesting, and I would also like to make a few general reflections as well. I think that the Commission's proposal is objectively imperfect and quite limited, particularly for cultural reasons. We have terrorism and then legal arms. We know there is a legal arms market, including online. There are, however, internet platforms which aren't on the usual platforms, which are separate, and that has to be looked at. The tone of the debate seems to be more Texan than European here, and so I'd ask everyone to be a bit more European and not be quite so American. We don't want to be too cowboy in our discussions. I think there is a lot of good things in this directive. Labelling arms, medical checks. I think that's very important. If someone's going to be allowed to use a weapon, then of course they should be subject to medical checks. Then on sports, hunting, collecting, there's a lot on there. which perhaps isn't so good, but I think we need to have to improve the part on converting arms. So I'm sure that the rapporteur and the shadows will be able to do some work on this and bring about a very balanced text.
Merci. Bien. Y a eu...
Thank you. 22 colleagues spoke. I think that shows the intensity of the debate. And I'll give the floor to Mr. Alain from the Commission.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, given the time we have, I think there are two main points to tackle here. Category B7, and then museums and collectors. There are a lot of other important points, but I think given how strict time is, we should stick to these two. On categories, particularly B7, we think that the working document is excellent and it identifies some interesting areas for work. We support the approach of basing this on the technical characteristics, and we can work on that, particularly point 423, which we think that's an interesting area for future work. Secondly, point on museums and collections. We think we're probably going to have to draw a distinction between museums, which are establishments that are checked by the state and which are provide an educational function. So they might be able to benefit from a certain amount of flexibility. But then we have collectors who don't fulfill the same social function. As you know, we don't say that collectors should be banned from collecting arms. With the directive, they can benefit from all of Category B. The only difference is that they can't have active Category A. They can't buy active Category A arms. So here, we're not sure whether private individuals should be able to have military-grade weapons at home, but at the moment we would say no. Thank you. I'll give the floor to the rapporteur, Vicky, to conclude.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and address some of the questions that have been raised, and also I might send you back to do some more homework and thought on some of the issues. First of all, on the suggestion that the proposal should just be thrown in the bin or sent back to the Commission, I will table an amendment that suggests it should be sent back to the Commission so that we can have a democratic vote on that. However, even though there are many problems with the proposal, I don't think that is a perfect solution either. First of all, to pick up with what Virginie pointed out, the situation in Paris and others has pointed that there are some existing loopholes, particularly on the treatment of deactivated weapons, and particularly from what I've learned on weapons that were treated as blank firers, weapons that had been live and then converted so they were supposed to only ever be able to fire blanks and then converted back. So in answer to Dieter's question, firearms that were live but then converted into blanks, those are the ones I think should stay in their original category, as opposed to firearms that have been built to only be able to fire blanks. And I understand from experts those are very different. In addition, if we don't deal with the Commission's proposal, there's this real concern that the deactivation regulation that the Commission has adopted may actually have made it even more unclear. Yes, we need common standards on deactivations, but some of the standards are raising some very serious concerns that they may be less robust than what we have in some member states. I've written to the Commission about this, 2 weeks ago, and we still haven't received a reply. I would urgently like to have a reply on that issue, because I do think we need to address, as Dieter suggested, maybe a parallel process that people who have existing deactivated weapons to existing standards, it's not always possible to do to the new as well, to allow them to keep them. So thank you for that. Thank you to the S&D for saying you like the component approach, essential components. That leaves the question of which components are essential. So more homework on that. I do think that there are historical collectors, reenactors, who hold truly deactivated Category A firearms and take them for educational processes. And I think if they are truly deactivated, even if they are Category A, they should be allowed to keep them, maybe with a licence or controls on storage. But I think that I would like to see that at least put to a vote. On the military reserve in Finland and other countries, absolutely we need to be aware that different countries have different ways that they are protecting themselves against growing threats. And this is partly why I think it's so important that the member states can keep their special authorisations. On collectors and museums, we will do some more work on what is a reasonable need to collect and what are the responsibilities of doing that. On internet sales and online sales, yes, there need to be controls on that, but maybe not a complete ban. Maybe, as I said, this introduction that the last transfer is watched. I hear a lot of people saying that they'd like to see some more about safe storage, and I'm sure we can do some work on sharing best practice on that. And I'd just like to say thank you all very much for this, and I do hope we can work through the next few months to find a response. My final point is, if it takes longer to get this approval right, let's get it right. Because we're all working to find a solution that does not unduly burden the law-abiding citizen or put unnecessary costs, but at the same time closes the loophole that has been exploited on our streets. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Vicky.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you to the rapporteur. I would just say that it's not just the shadows who've been flooded with emails on this. For the people listening to us via web streaming, I think the debate clearly shows that members of the Parliament are aware of the situation. I'm French, and I would say that this test is not merely a reaction to the attacks in Paris. Do remember that in countries such as France and others, Europe can't just say nothing when something happens as serious as what happened a few months ago in France. I would just recall as well, the hearing is on the 15th of March, and then the deadline for amendments is the 27th of April, and the preliminary examination of the text will be on the 20th of April. So thank you all, thank you to the shadows, and thank you in particular to Vicky, and good luck with your work in the coming days.